This is Whitley Strieber, and this is Dreamland. You've reached the edge of the world. This week's Dreamland is a very special program, so we're running it for 2 weeks in the free section, which means that I will not be here to wish you a happy Thanksgiving next weekend. All of us, everywhere in the world, always, if we look into our lives, can find a surprising amount to be thankful for. And in the United States, no matter how unhappy we may or may not be with the present state of our economy, our country, and our government, when you sit down to Thanksgiving dinner, it'll come to mind again just what a wonderful place we live in, what a beautiful country it is. So, happy Thanksgiving, and I'll see you again in 2 weeks. And do spread the word about this program. This is really very special. We've done very little over the years about the cabin witnesses who actually had close encounters at our cabin in upstate New York. Now listen to these. These are quite extraordinary testaments.
This is Whitley Strieber's Dreamland. We go deeper.
Well, today, folks, we're going to go back in time to 1989 to a little cabin in upstate New York that most of you probably are very well aware of. What you may not know, and because it's been so little remarked upon by everybody except me, is that there were more than one witness at that cabin who had close encounter experiences. 2 of them are with us today. 2 dear friends who have become dear friends over the years, Lori Barnes and Raven Dana. Both of them had close encounters at the cabin. In fact, they had very, very direct physical close encounters of a kind I wish I had had more of. Welcome to the show, Lori and Raven.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Okay, and the first voice was Lori Barnes. The second voice was Raven Dana. Lori Barnes is a poet and a writer. She is a retired stage performer. She is still having experiences as recently as last night. Lori, this incidentally is being recorded on October the 18th. So, Lori, I have to ask you, what happened last night?
I think you're on the right track, Whitley, with your connection with the beings with the dead, because just before I dozed off, by the way, I was very tired earlier than usual and had to go to sleep maybe an hour earlier than usual. And just as I was dozing off, I thought I smelled a funny kind of musty thing, but I thought it was coming from my open window because there's, at the moment, no air conditioning in my small apartment. And I had the window open, and but it was a kind of a funny smell. I thought it was coming from the street, but then again, it smelled strange. And suddenly, on my right, as I thought I had dozed off, was what looked like a woman, but not a woman, with shoulder-length blonde hair. And it looked familiar. She looked familiar. And she said, Lori. I said, yes. She said, you know me. I said, fine. She said, think. And I said, she said, I used to stay with you sometimes. And I looked at her, and suddenly I called her by name. I said, of course, Lenny. Her name was Lenore. And she passed away in the 1980s at a young age of lung cancer. And we called her Lenny. And she was a good friend. And she stayed with me occasionally in my old apartment. And she said, I said, I'm glad to see you. And she smiled. And she said, look to your left. And I looked to my left, and there was a woman kind of floating, and very slender, long hair, and sort of Asian looking. And I was a little bit afraid because she seemed to be holding something. She wanted to do something to me, and I said, hello, I'm very tired. If you're going to do something, I wish you wouldn't. She said, this is good. And she kind of rolled me further. I was on my right side. She kind of rolled me further over and gave me what felt like a little zap, electrical thing, and I conked out. But this morning, I remembered it, and I awoke very drowsy with a headache on my left side that I had to have a couple of coffees to get over, and I felt a little woozy. And suddenly I thought, who was that? Who was that? I tried to nail it, and Whitley, I think it was Dora.
Well, Dora, who she's referring to, was also another person who was at our cabin and who had less experience there than Raven and Laurie did, but who was still very heavily involved and was a dear friend who died tragically of colon cancer when she was only 50 years old a few years ago. So that moves me very much, Laurie. Now, Laurie, this is not the first time that you've had experience with the dead. And folks, let me take you back again, as I said I was going to do earlier, to an evening or a day at the cabin. Laurie is there, Raven is there, some other people are there, quite a few people actually. We have a filmmaker there who has got a low-light camera and is going to be taking video of all night of a certain hallway, and we're hoping the visitors will come down that hallway. Now, a lot happened, and we're going to go through it all in detail, but the first thing that happened was Laurie met somebody on the road while out walking. Do you remember that, Laurie?
Oh, yes.
Tell us about it.
I was out walking in the first cabin you had.
That's what I mean. This is all the first cabin.
Yeah. And it was just out by your woods, not too far. And you had like a little shack of some kind.
That's right, my son's little playhouse.
Yeah. And all of a sudden, I saw this figure, and I couldn't believe it. It was my brother, Jonathan, my younger brother, who was quite a bit younger than I, who had totally disappeared in the early 1970s.
He disappeared and that was investigated by the police, as I recall.
Yes, the FBI. And I was the last person in my family to see him alive. And we had been quite close. He was a very dear soul, but he had had a very tough life and had turned to drugs and alcohol. He was a very talented painter, artist, and the last I knew, he was on his way to Europe with his big portfolio, and he had shown me his passport, and that was the last anyone saw of him. And then he dropped off the face of the earth, but he was there by your little shack, wearing a sort of a white toga, and with his long, shoulder-length blonde hair. And I said, Jonathan, what are you doing here? And he said, I came to tell you I'm fine, sis, because I had been very worried about him. And he said, I'm fine, don't worry about me. And he said, sis, you're in the right place.
Well, good, I'm glad. Raven Dana. Raven is a life coach and a stress management coach, and very, very good at it indeed. Her website is what is it? Why don't you say it? I wrote it down, Raven, and I'm not, my handwriting is so poor.
Yeah, it's stresswizardcoaching.com is the website.
Stresswizardcoaching.com, and people can reach you by email as well, I believe.
Yes, Raven@stresswizardcoaching.com.
All right. So Raven you've gotten into stress management, and you have gone on a long path, because I remember when we got and both ladies, by the way, Raven and Lori, both came to us in the same way. As Ann Strieber has said many times, she was reading the mail, and they both had very articulate, carefully constructed letters that were obviously from people of good intelligence and who seemed to be rational, down to earth, but having experiences that in one way or another alerted us to their authenticity, because there were things in their descriptions that were similar to things other people were telling us, but which had not been published anywhere. So we were alerted to such people, and we invited quite a few of them to meet us and to come up to our cabin, and Raven and Lori were among those. That's how they happened to be there. Now, Raven, tell us about your early years when this first started to happen to you.
Well, in my earliest years, I had experiences as a child of something standing at the foot of my bed. And in my household, that was not, how can I say this? There was no separation in my household between the ordinary world and, well, someone would have a dream and it would be listened to and talked about, and mythology was talked about, and my grandmother had very prophetic dreams, and the family just accepted those. And so when I started seeing something at the foot of my bed and talked and mentioned it, it wasn't dismissed. It was neither encouraged nor dismissed. It was considered to be, well, part of the unseen world that we don't know that much about. So I had these experiences for a number of years where I would see a figure at the foot of my bed, and it was the classic figure that you would see on the cover of Communion. I would have experiences of being taken to, or being these experiences of floating down to this place by the river. I lived near the Hudson River. And being shown things or seen things. And again, the classic thing, even as a child, is this person spoke to me inside my head. And that went on for a number of years, and then it stopped. That faded. I saw a number of things that I didn't understand. I saw things about the planet, things about the sky, things about earth changes, things that showed back up in my life many years later. But just prior to contacting you, Whitley, I had a couple of experiences with my daughters. By then I had two small daughters, and I had an experience in which when I first moved into the apartment I was in, I was standing in the room, and something knocked on every window of that house all the way around. I mean, this was the third floor, and I wasn't alone. There was two other people there, and it was just highly strange and very unusual. Shortly thereafter, I started having experiences that were, I just actually thought they were dreams. And I did, though, I was inspired to draw a picture of what I had seen as a child and show it to my daughters and say, have you ever seen anybody that looked like this? And they actually said no. But with that picture still in the house, I saw the cover I went to a bookstore a couple weeks later and saw the cover of Communion, and that's when I wrote to you, Whitley. So my older daughter had been having nosebleeds by then. And I had a few experiences in which I was I'd wake up at night, I'd think I heard something or think I saw something, and then have an experience of seeing of what I would now call a visitor holding one of my daughters in their arms. So that was the kind of thing that prompted my communication with you in the first place.
Well, folks, as we take you down this extraordinary path to one of the, frankly, great, most multiple witnessed UFO close encounter experiences of all times, I hope you're finding it as interesting as I am, even though I know it like the back of my hand. Hearing Raven and Laurie talking about it again as it develops is extraordinary. We'll be right back. We're talking to two of the cabin witnesses who were actually witness to extraordinary experiences at the old Strieber cabin in upstate New York. Life coach Raven Dana, her website, stresswizardcoaching.com. You can reach her at raven@stresswizardcoaching.com. She is obviously quite an expert, having had some very interesting and unusual stress experiences in her life. But beyond that, she also has a great deal of knowledge of a more conventional kind about stress management. Also, poet and writer Laurie Barnes is with us. Laurie and Anne became close friends after Laurie sent us a letter in the early days, right after Communion was published. And Laurie personally typed, well, looking at the letters, which we've still got, Laurie, it must have been at least 2,000 or 3,000 letters that had come in by hand. Because back in those days, we still had the mistaken belief that the scientific community would be interested in such an extraordinary thing happening to people, and we were getting the letters typed so that researchers would be able to access them more easily. You did that typing. Yes.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Yes, I did.
You did.
And when I think back, what extraordinary experiences from all over. And some were in broken English, which, like from different countries, that I had a hard time, putting into proper English, but somehow we managed. But they were fascinating. And a lot of them had to do with what we talked about today.
Oh, yes. Now, but I just wanted to touch on that, and what I want to do now is to go back to that day at the cabin, and ask you, Raven, I don't recall if you have any specific memories of during the day, before we went to the cave. And I'll describe going to the cave in a few minutes. But I don't think you have any. Do you recall anything? Do you recall, for example, Laurie coming in and telling us about her brother?
I don't. I remember the conversation the following morning and talking about Laurie and her experience with her brother. But I don't remember. I remember it from the following morning. I don't remember it from the day before. Yeah.
Yeah, she told me that afternoon, right after it happened, and Anne. But we were. Oh gosh, we were doing so many different things. It was there were a lot of people there. You may have been being interviewed by Drew Cummings, the filmmaker who was there at that time.
Mm-hmm. Possibly, yes.
Yeah, and you were interviewed again the next day. Those tapes, by the way, are something I'm looking for and hope to be able to put up on Unknown Country in our subscriber section at some point. I know I still have copies of them somewhere, but I think they're an important document. Now, later that afternoon, we went, or rather in the evening, we went to a certain cave, which is a place where I had encounters before. Did you also go, Laurie?
No.
No, you didn't. It was an arduous trip, but I believe you went, Raven.
Yes, I remember that.
Yeah, why don't you tell us about that experience? It's pretty intense because of the necessity to creep along that ledge, and it was raining.
Yes, it was wet and raining, and difficult to get down into it, and just difficult to get into it. A very small space, and yet being in that space and it was like being in another world. It felt like being very far below the ground. A lot of energy, a lot of interesting way the sound played off the walls. the interesting way the little bit of starlight or reflected light that there was kind of illuminated the space. It was just a fascinating experience. And if I remember correctly, we did some overtone chanting and we meditated in that space.
That's right. And I was very disappointed that nothing happened because, just the week before I had a close encounter in that space. And I had felt sure that we would get some kind of a response. And that's why I took the risk of taking what must have been 5 or 6 of us down there. And it was really hard to get to. And I was very worried someone would fall off the cliff. And nearly did, actually. So, but it was a place that I went to alone a lot, and an extraordinary spot, in my opinion. I'm sorry I lost it. In any case, we came back. We spent the evening together. Drew Cummings set up his camera to point down the hallway, and Raven, you were in one room alone. Laurie was with another person in another room whom I have lost touch with, so I'm not going to mention her name here, who also had an encounter. I wish I was back in touch with her, but I can't find her. In any case, so that was the situation. Drew set his cameras up, and Dora and I and Ed Conroy and Andrew, my son, went out to spend the night in the woods because the cabin was so crowded, and by that time it had stopped raining, and very suddenly the rain stopped and the sky just opened up with a beautiful array of stars. It was just a wonderful moment. I saw it happen. It was quite unusual. We went to bed, and folks, when we get back, Laurie and Raven will tell you what happened. We'll be right back. We're back. We're talking to Laurie Barnes. Laurie is a poet and writer. She is a retired stage performer. She is still having experiences, as she described so eloquently at the beginning of the show. Raven Dana is a life coach specializing in stress management. Her website is stresswizardcoaching.com. Now, let's go back to that evening. Raven, you retired at some point, probably about 10, I would guess.
Yes.
And what happened then?
What I remember was waking up feeling warm. I was hot. And I got up and I used the restroom, and I came back and I pushed the window open and rolled back over to go to sleep. And I wasn't falling asleep. I was still a little bit on the warm side. And the next thing I remember is the sensation of something. When I felt the sensation, I thought it was a skunk or a raccoon or something. I felt the sensation of something that I had imagined must have come through the window, because it was from that direction down by the foot of the bed, of weight on the bed, like something stepping in and pressing against my leg. And the first thought I had was, oh, this is great. I'm going to get skunked or bit in the middle of the night. Now,
let's just stop here for a moment. She was in a bedroom downstairs that was next to my son's bedroom. And this was one of the rooms that I was most concerned about as a young at that time. And I had the screens screwed closed, so they could not be opened. So nothing could have come in through the screen, which you realized, I believe.
Yep, I hadn't at that particular point. My first thought was something came through the window. I had not realized that at that point.
Now, what happened then?
Well, what happened next was that I very carefully and slowly, without moving my leg, kind of rolled the top of my body around so I can look over my shoulder to see what was there. And much to my surprise, what was there was quite a bit larger. It was the shape of a small person. I could see the side of the head. I could see the crouch, the 1 foot. There was 1 foot on one limb on the bed touching. That's what was touching the back of my leg. And when it turned its head slightly, I could see the glint of the outdoor light. It was there was, it wasn't bright out. Of course, it was the middle of the night, but maybe it was refracted moonlight. It was, there was some small amount of light, but I could see that light reflected in the large, dark eye. And that's when I thought, what do I do? Luckily, my first experience wasn't fear. My first experience was, well, what do I do with this? What do I do with this? And as I thought that, the being raised a hand, and without even thinking, without letting myself give in to the strangeness of it, I reached up and touched those fingers. And what I felt in that moment was, the closest I can describe it is an electrical current, but it wasn't painful. It wasn't like when you touch the prongs, the wrong way. It was but a charge, a clear vibration, electricity from my hand down the side of my body and to that point on my leg where that foot was touching. And my thought was, go down the hall, be seen, go down the hall. I clearly had the impression that, what do you want me to do was kind of the feeling I had. It was asking me, what do you want me to do? And I said, go down the hall in my mind.
Which, of course, would have taken it right in front of the low-light camera that was running at the time.
Yes. But that's not what happened. It, backwards, it went back out the window, went through the window, went back out the window, kind of backwards. And then I got scared, and I sat up. And that's also at the point I realized the window was not open. And then I had desperately needed to go use the restroom, and I was too scared to get up. And when I sat up and I brought the covers up, and I just thought about it. And when I closed my eyes, I clearly saw, like the eye of Horus, but the flipped eye, the other eye. I guess it's the other eye of Horus, but it looked like the eye of Horus, just facing the other way. And I found that it was frightening, but it was intriguing. I then entered in my mind into this puzzle. Well, what could this possibly have to do with the visitors? And it happened twice. I closed my eyes a second time, and I saw it again very clearly. I thought, okay, that's it. I'm done. I'm just going to sit here until the sun comes up, which is what I did. And by then
remember that Eye of Horus, folks, because that will figure again in this experience in quite an extraordinary way. Go ahead, Raven.
And in any case, by then, that's just what I did. I sat with my eyes open because I didn't want to see it again. I thought through all the things I knew about mythology and, everything, any connection I could think of that might make some sort of sense out of what I had experienced. And in the meantime, I had also had an increasingly difficult like an allergic reaction. I was having an allergic reaction. I was having trouble breathing. My eyes were red. My sinuses were plugged. I was feeling by the time I finally got up, I was feeling very sick. I was feeling bad. And that's what I did. I just waited till the sun came up, till it was light enough for me to go out. I used the restroom, and at that point, went towards the table where you came down the stairs and basically handed me a notebook and said, write down what just happened. Which
yes,
I did.
Exactly. And I also took a picture of you.
Yes.
A picture which I still have and which we will have up on the site for this, of Raven Dana, who was obviously having in quite a state of shock and having an allergic reaction. You can see the swelling around her face. And I had warned everybody that afternoon that if you did get into this situation, a close encounter, that an allergic reaction was a possibility because it was certainly something that had happened to me. I also remember experiences where that touching occurred and that actually quite pleasant sensation.
Yes.
Yeah, it's not painful.
No.
And I think it's kind of immobilizing. It was for me anyway. So that was that. I think, though, Raven, that this ranks, and what Laurie is going to tell us in just a few minutes, rank as among the most open and completely physical close encounters that has ever happened, that has ever been recorded by anybody. And I had maybe one or two that were as physical, but never while I was that conscious, because I was usually too scared. I was beside myself. It was truly a remarkable experience, and not to be forgotten, especially contextualized, because that wasn't the only time when we were at the cabin and the dead and the visitors showed up together. And I'm hoping that some of the people who were in the other cabin experienced it. Laurie and Raven were not in it, where the visitors showed up in the living room and the dead showed up in the basement at the same time. Will be willing to talk on the air. It's been a long time. And maybe they're less reticent about it, but I do have all of their written notes to this day. Now, Laurie, you were in the next room with our friend. The two of you were there, and I don't know whether you were actually asleep or not. People didn't do a lot of sleeping in that cabin.
No. I had gone to bed around the same time as Raven, I believe. And I had dozed, I believe. But all of a sudden, I had one ear open because I was expecting something. And I heard a peculiar noise coming down the hall, like an animal scraping.
Now, coming down the hall, interestingly enough, where the camera was, and we'll get back to that in a bit. Go ahead.
Yeah, like a scraping, a walking, like an animal. And my door was partly ajar. So with a brief, I could see a faint light. But suddenly it came more open. And into the room came a being which promptly sat on my bed and stared at me. And I'd say it was a being roughly, 3 to 4 feet tall, very slender, willowy, with huge eyes, looked right through me, and long fingers, because it used one hand and said, like sort of pointed, said, "Don't worry, we have no plans for you, or we're not interested in you. You can go back to sleep."
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, so you turned over and immediately went back to sleep.
I was wondering why he came in at all.
Well, right.
Unless it was because I was restless and, wanted me to sleep. But anyway, and then, I went to sleep. Well, she sort of touched me, and I felt that what Raven was talking about, that familiar sort of electrical current, which sort of paralyzes.
It does, yes, I agree.
Yeah, and it doesn't hurt, but it's a definite current.
Yes.
And then I blacked out. But I remembered it clearly, and still do, very, very clearly.
I wish I had been able to track your roommate down, because she was there and saw this happen.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. She was awake too. So it was truly an extraordinary experience. So, Laurie, at this point in time, you had seen your dead brother in the afternoon.
Yeah.
Then in the evening, you had this experience, and you got up the next morning, and what were your thoughts at that point when you realized Raven and your roommate had also had things happen during the night?
I thought it was wonderful that we had all had the same experience, pretty much, because it was like your book, it was a confirmation.
It was a confirmation for all of us, but unfortunately not for the media, because or the scientific community, who are still as dismissive of this now as they were before. And now the public has gone down the road with them to the extent that they are much more dismissive of it now than they were in those days.
I know.
It's very sad that this is something that is actually being lost to history.
I know.
And none of us have any real idea of what's happening. And I want to ask the two of you what your sense of it is. And I'm going to go back to the cabin and to the events that happened to me and to my son and to the filmmaker, Drew Cummings, in a few minutes. But Raven, if you will, why don't we just take our break now, and that way we don't have to interrupt ourselves. So we're going to take a little break, and we'll be right back with Raven Dana and Laurie Barnes. Who's crackling? One of you is crackling.
Hello?
Laurie?
Hello?
Yes.
Raven? Someone's making crackling noises with their phone.
I was hearing the crackling, but I'm not moving.
Well,
I don't know.
okay, well, let's try not to move the phones.
Okay.
Okay, here, let me take a little more silence, and then we'll go back. We're talking to Raven Dana and Laurie Barnes. Both had close encounters at the old Strieber cabin in upstate New York, and both were remarkable encounters. Raven is a life coach and a specialist in stress management. Her website is stresswizardcoaching.com, and you can reach her at raven@stresswizardcoaching.com. Laurie is a poet and writer, a retired stage performer. She's still having experiences to this day, as we heard earlier. Now, the aftermath of this was as follows in my life. I was sleeping down in the woods because the cabin was too crowded. And I also was sort of hoping that something would happen somewhere to somebody, because that's why we were there. I didn't know of anything that would transpire in the cabin. But about dawn, I came up with my son to the house, and this entailed walking up through a little woods and then coming to the top of a little hillock which overlooked the house and the deck. And as we were moving toward the house, a figure came hurrying down the deck. This figure was about 3.5 feet tall. It was translucent gray in color, moving very quickly and wearing a cowl, like a monk's cowl. It went across the backyard and went off across a road, and a dirt road that was there, and then into a deeper woods beyond. And as it moved off into the deeper woods, it moved jerking side to side to avoid the trees. In other words, it may have looked translucent, but it was something physical, or it wouldn't have had to avoid the trees. I went into the cabin to find the filmmaker and his wife in a state of upset because of what had just happened to them. And this must have been within an hour of what had happened to the two of you. What happened to them was as follows. The filmmaker woke up and saw, staring down at him, a great leathery-looking head, and he was asleep. They were asleep in the living room on a fold-out couch. And he saw this, and he was appalled. And soon as he felt fear, it turned, the head transformed into a head of Horus, which we later, he didn't know who Horus was, but he later described this, and it was clearly the head of Horus. And Raven, you had seen the eye of Horus in your mind. And, I can't even begin to theorize. It's clear that whatever's happening isn't what we think, or how we describe this as alien contact. But if it is alien contact, it's just fundamentally different in its basic nature from what we might have expected. This is not a scientific team from another planet coming and taking blood samples at all. not when the dead are involved, not when mythological beings become involved. And so it's really extremely mysterious, very, very mysterious. And Raven, you have had so much of this experience, and Laura, you have too. I want you to each give me your idea of what you think it may be about. And Laurie, when we come back to you, be remembering the experience you had when you were pregnant, because that is very important. I think Laurie and Raven have both had extremely important experiences, and that one is very important also. Go ahead, Raven, if you will. And good luck.
Yeah, really, thanks. I do think it is connected to, I think it has something to do with the opening up of our unconscious. I think that the visitors use the symbols available to communicate because that's kind of the space they live in. And I think that the whole idea of the falcon-headed god and Horus, and I have a daughter named Falcon, and that's who she's named for. And I think
she was named long before these experiences.
Yes. And my study of the mythologies and the gods and goddesses, and I think that it has to do with that. That there's so much more to reality than our limited, than what we experience, because it's limited by our understanding and also limited by how we factor things out and choose not to see things and dismiss our dreams and dismiss our intuitions. And I believe it has to do with that idea, like what we see when we read about Horus and the mystery schools, of not just immortality, but the ongoing nature of being alive, immortality, but also the depth of understanding and perception that arises when we can just step outside that box for a minute to experience the other beings, to experience the dead, to experience that other place just on the edge of our conscious awareness where they live in the unconscious, where we could, in fact, I believe, and through my experiences since then, be able to more deliberately, more directly touch into that place and have experiences with the dead and with other beings there, even if we don't understand them, even if our conscious mind can't translate them. It's still enriching in a way that leads us to be more and more a larger, expanded human being. I think it's a way of having conscious evolution occur, where we feel the depth of our connections with each other and with the planet itself, with the earth, with the living essence of things that we would otherwise miss.
Well, see, folks, I told you they were extraordinarily articulate. That was a brilliant answer, I have to say, Raven. That is from a lifetime of experience and extraordinary experience, and it's extremely cogent, no question. Now, I want to just briefly mention what happened with the camera, because, of course, I was under such pressure at the time to get some kind of proof that I never did get, and the fact that I didn't get it has colored my life in a very negative way. We didn't get anything on the camera, even though Laurie and the lady who was with her were both aware of the sound of the being coming down the hall that was being videotaped, and saw the door open from that hall. We still got nothing. So it was extremely disappointing. Now, Laurie, you've had more than one experience with the visitors with this business, and one of the most extraordinary ones happened to you back in the early 50s when you were pregnant. And
no, it was 1959.
Oh, 59, I'm sorry, when you were pregnant.
Yes.
And you were lying in bed one night, and what happened?
I was in bed alone. I had been reading a book on childbirth, and I was sitting up, and I think I dozed off, I'm not sure, but all of a sudden I heard a clattering, which awoke me in the kitchen, which was attached to my bedroom. And my son, who was then, I guess about 5, was down the hall from me, George. And he's now an adult, was down the hall sleeping, and it worried me because the fire escape was on that kitchen by my bedroom, and the window was open. And we were living in Long Island then. And my husband was at work nights, and he worked at the old Star Club at that time in New York. And I'm all alone in the bedroom and about 7 months pregnant. And all of a sudden, my bedroom door, which is partially open, swung open, and 3 little men came storming in. And
what exactly did they look like?
Well, they were, I guess, they looked like little dwarves. And I later described them as leprechauns because at the time I had no other frame of reference. I believe this was, though not my first experience with the visitors. I think my experience goes way back to my childhood.
Oh, and maybe even before that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
go ahead and say what then happened.
But anyway, one of them who wore a kind of a strange headgear, and he had a wizened face, like a little, I don't know, gray, wrinkled face. He scared me. It scared the heck out of me. And he came up, and he said, "Don't be afraid. We're not here to harm you. We're only interested in the little girl you're carrying." Now, at that time...
Well, that was calculated to calm you down.
At that time, nobody knew the sex of what they were carrying.
No.
Yeah, and I said, "Oh, great, you know." And he said, "Be calm." And 2 little guys looked like him, but they had the hoods on, like you said before.
Right.
They were down at the foot of the bed. And they seemed to be kind of waiting there, almost reaching out like if they had to hold me down or something. But he had a wand-type thing, like a little scepter of some kind. And he reached out and he touched me with it. And a kind of a shock went through me. And after that, I kind of blacked out.
Now, didn't you at one moment say how ugly you thought they were?
Yes. Oh, yes.
And
I said, "You're too ugly. Don't touch me."
And what did he say in reply?
He said, "Don't say that, because someday you may be just like us."
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's where I wanted to end the program. And that's because what we have talked about here is something truly new. Laurie and Raven are people who live at the edge of the enclosure that is the human experience, and where a lot of you also live. And you know, we're all together in this extraordinary place, but we're having a problem here, and that is that what is happening at this edge is being diminished by assumptions about alien contact. We actually have never articulated what this is, but it is very clear that it is a part of the human experience and part of our evolution. Raven, do you have any final comment?
The more open we are able to be in having the experience without trying to translate it, the more available the information becomes to us, and the more connected we become to it. And I think that's the only other thing I would like to say.
Without trying to translate it, folks, that's the final word here. Thank you so much for listening to us on Dreamland.
You've been listening to Dreamland. Be sure to tune in again next week. Dreamland is brought to you by UnknownCountry.com and our family of subscribers. Our news editor is Ann Strieber. Our science reporter is Linda Moulton Howe. Our webmaster is Daniel Stiegel. And I'm your Dreamland announcer, Brian Arnold. Thanks for listening. We'll be back next week.